Hello and welcome to this lecture on bioenergy and land use, the local and global challenges. My name's Jeanette Whitaker and I'm a senior research scientist at the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology in Lancaster. By background, I'm a plant and soil ecologist and biogeochemist, and today I'm going to talk to you about research from 3 projects conducted at the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology with collaborators across other UK universities and institutions. And these research projects have been funded by the Energy Technologies Institute, the Natural Environment Research Council, and the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council. So in the introduction to this lecture, I'll first of all give you some definitions. I'll talk about the different types of bioenergy and the current global production and use of bioenergy. And I'll also talk about the potential benefits for climate change mitigation. I'll give you an overview of the development of bioenergy policy, the historical and political context, and some of the controversy around the use of biofuels and the promotion of biofuels and bioenergy. And I'll talk about some of the potential risks of increasing our deployment of bioenergy. I'll then focus on the research we've been doing here at CEH, and this is focused on assessing carbon savings from bioenergy production. So first of all, I'll describe to you the life cycle of bioenergy production across which we assess greenhouse gas savings. And then I'll talk about the research we're particularly doing here, which is focused on the impacts of land use and land management of bioenergy crop cultivation and how that might impact on soil carbon stocks and greenhouse gas emissions. And I'll also give you a little demonstration of a model that's been developed with collaborators at the University of Aberdeen called the Ecosystem Land Use Model. Finally, I'll talk about activities I've been leading as a Knowledge Exchange Fellow for the Natural Environment Research Council. The point of the Knowledge Exchange Fellowship is to maximise the research impact. So it's making sure that the research that we've been doing here over the last 10 years reaches decision makers, that we synthesise the information in a way that can be received by stakeholders such as industry and policymakers, and it makes a change. So, to begin, first of all, bioenergy encompasses lots of different feedstocks, conversion technologies and end users. It's a very complex renewable energy source. Bioenergy is simply energy derived from biomass, and that biomass can be food crops, perennial energy crops, forestry and crop residues, and organic waste. And we use some terminology for describing different types of bioenergy dependent on the feedstocks it's made from. So we have first-generation crops made from first-generation bioenergy made from food crops such as wheat, sugar beet, sugar cane, maize and jatropha. Then we have second-generation bioenergy, which is sometimes also called cellulosic bioenergy. And this is made from perennial grasses such as Miscanthus and switchgrass, or woody crops such as short-rotation coppice, willow and poplar. And also can be made from forest biomass and residues and crop residues. And the difference with second generation is that the whole of the plant material is used, whereas with first generation you're simply using the grain or the oil seed. Finally, bioenergy can be produced from waste, but I'm not going to talk about that today. We're just going to focus on second generation bioenergy, and particularly crops which are currently grown in the UK, which include Miscanthus and short rotation coppice willow. These crops can be turned into transport fuel, liquid fuel such as ethanol or biodiesel. They can be burnt for heat and electricity or converted into biogas. So as you can see, bioenergy is complex. Currently in the world, biomass contributes 10% of world energy supply. Now that's quite a large number, 58 exajoules, but that consists of traditional and modern bioenergy. And what I mean by that is traditional bioenergy is biomass burnt in inefficient cook stoves, typically in developing countries. And these are polluting and inefficient, and not the kind of bioenergy that we want to use going forward to tackle climate change. Modern bioenergy makes a smaller contribution to world energy supply currently, 2% of world electricity and 4% of road transport fuel, but that is increasing. In the UK, bioenergy contributes 71% of our renewable energy use. That's across heat, electric and transport fuel. So it's a really significant component of the renewable energy we use in the country. And across our whole energy use, it's around 4.5% of UK electric and road transport fuel and 2.5% heat. And if you're interested in more statistics around bioenergy, there's a reference on the slide to a government website. Okay, so I'm now going to talk about the political and historical context of bioenergy policy and why, through policy development, this has contributed to some of the controversy and backlash against biofuels particularly, and bioenergy more broadly. So in 1974, the International Energy Agency was established. And this organisation was established not for environmental reasons, but to address problems of energy security and concerns around energy security following the oil crises of the 1970s. In 1978, a specific task force of IEA was set up for bioenergy. But again, this was for energy security reasons because it was recognised that bioenergy could contribute to independent country energy security. Bioenergy can be grown by different countries and domestically for their own use. Now, it wasn't until the mid-80s, late 80s, that IEA actually introduced environmental goals alongside these energy security goals, introducing statements that this energy had to be produced in an environmentally acceptable manner and that policies had to be integrated with energy security and economic growth. And so this was the first time that it was thought that actually renewable energy could contribute to environmental goals. Through the 90s, there was an increasing awareness of climate change with the UNFCCC Rio Summit and the signing of the Kyoto Protocol in 1997. And around the same time, the European Union developed a white paper and then 2 directives aimed at increasing the proportion of renewable energy used in the EU, and particularly electricity, renewable electricity, and the promotion of biofuels. But there were problems with these directives, and there were a lot of concerns raised from academics and also from NGOs. The reason for these concerns was that the carbon neutrality of bioenergy in these directives was assumed. And what I mean by that is that it was assumed that if you replaced fossil fuels with a bioenergy source, that you would automatically save carbon. These carbon reductions were assumed and there were no criteria for sourcing sustainable biomass. And it wasn't until the 2003 directive on the promotion of biofuels that there was a requirement to actually monitor and report on carbon emission reductions. So over the next few years, there were increasing voices of concern in the academic literature about the potential environmental harm that biofuels could do. And this was particularly focused around unintended consequences which might lead to increased greenhouse gas emissions from bioenergy rather than decreased greenhouse gas emissions. And these are 2 very highly cited papers from Timothy Searchinger and Joseph Fagione, talking about the issues of deforestation for biofuel production and also the idea that you could get increased greenhouse gas emissions if you grew food crops for biofuel use. Around the same time, the UK government commissioned a really important report called the Gallagher Review, which reported on the indirect effects of biofuels, and this led to a freezing of the biofuel targets for the UK. Since that time, we've made great steps and strides in improving the sustainability of biofuels and bioenergy with the EU Climate and Energy Package, known as the RED, Renewable Energy Directive, and that's had amendments in the last couple of years to address these unintended consequences of indirect land use change, and we're working towards new targets in the RED 2 with targets for 2030. Now, when we think about bioenergy, it's different from other renewable energy sources because it has such a large land footprint. And if bioenergy is to make a meaningful contribution to global energy supply, land use change will be required on a global scale. Land is a finite resource, and we need to use it optimally to deliver food, fibre and energy, whilst also mitigating climate change, conserving biodiversity and preventing further environmental degradation. Now, bioenergy does have real potential benefits, There's studies which show that it could deliver up to 50% of global primary energy by 2100. If it's successfully combined with carbon capture and storage technologies, it could deliver net negative emissions. And there are plenty of studies which show through integrated assessment modelling that without bioenergy, keeping warming at below 2 degrees will be almost impossible and will certainly be more costly. So there are real potential gains here, but there's also significant concerns because of this land use change requirement. So the environmental risks of maximising bioenergy deployment can be described in two ways. So we talk about land use change as direct land use change and indirect land use change. Indirect land use change is where there's an unintended consequence of biofuel production. So this is where bioenergy crop cultivation displaces food production onto land which might contain high carbon stocks, such as peatlands or tropical forests. It might result in deforestation. And this displacement effect isn't intended and it's very hard to quantify, but it could result in this biofuel production actually leading to increased greenhouse gas emissions rather than decreased emissions. I'm not going to talk about indirect land use change today. It could be the topic of a whole lecture on its own because it's incredibly complex to quantify and to model, but it is an important issue to consider. What I'm focusing on today is direct land use change. And this is where simply one piece of land that's being used for one thing is converted to something else. So for example, an annual crop is being grown and that is changed to a bioenergy crop such as Miscanthus. Or a grassland is ploughed and planted with short rotation coppice willow. This direct land use change also has implications for the greenhouse gas savings that can be achieved from bioenergy because they vary depending on the type of land that you're converting, the type of crop or feedstock which you're growing, and how that land is managed in terms of fertiliser inputs, the amount of harvesting machinery and other things. And this is the area that we're working on at CEH. So when we want to calculate the greenhouse gas savings from bioenergy, as I said, we need to consider this across the whole life cycle. The life cycle of bioenergy goes from the cultivation and the planting of the crop in the field right through to its end use. And there are a range of emissions which are resulting from different parts of this process. So in the field, you get greenhouse gas emissions from the crop, you get CO2 emissions and uptake from the growth of the crop, you get methane emissions and uptake in the soil, and nitrous oxide emissions as a consequence mainly of fertiliser use, but also just nitrous oxide emissions from background soil nitrogen as well. You also can get changes in the soil carbon stock, and this occurs because often you're moving from an annual cropping system, which has been ploughed, into a perennial cropping system, such as for Miscanthus and willow, where there's no ploughing or tillage, and this can lead to an increase in soil carbon stocks or a preservation of soil carbon stocks. And also these crops are very large. They grow 3 or 4 metres, they produce huge above ground biomass, and this leads to increased inputs into the soil. And this can also contribute to increased soil carbon sequestration over time. You can also get indirect nitrous oxide emissions which result from nitrate leaching into watercourses, which is then later emitted as nitrous oxide. So you can see that in the cultivation stage there's a huge complexity of carbon and nitrogen cycling which can affect the greenhouse gas balance of the crop. You also get greenhouse gas emissions from the production of the nitrogen fertiliser, from the harvesting, the processing and the transport, and from the final combustion. And these sums all have to be calculated to calculate the overall greenhouse gas balance or carbon balance of the crop. Now, 10 years ago, I was working on a project called the UK Energy Research Centre, and I was asked to look at life cycle assessment of bioenergy. So life cycle assessment is a tool that is used by industry and by policymakers to assess this energy and greenhouse gas balance over the whole life cycle of a product or a process. It's used for bioenergy, it's used for a whole range of products. And what I was asked to do was look at lots and lots of published papers of life cycle assessments of different types of biofuels and bioenergy to try and explain why they varied so much. Because we were being told that the literature on bioenergy was really confusing because some papers said bioenergy was brilliant, it was going to save lots of greenhouse gas emissions, and other papers were saying actually it was going to release more emissions than it would save. And so we wanted to try and understand why there were these big differences in reported results. So the figure on the slide shows you the summation of data from a lot of publications on bioenergy. And you can see that on the x-axis there are a number of different feedstocks being used to produce bioethanol in this case. And at the y-axis are the grams of CO2 equivalent per megajoule of fuel. The red dotted line is the global warming potential of petrol, which we're comparing the biofuel against. And the orange line is the 60% greenhouse gas saving, which is mandated by the Renewable Fuel Standard and is mandated by the EU for new biofuel plants being built. And what you can see is that there's a big range for all of these different feedstocks. For the second generation crops, which are on the right-hand side of the chart, they're mainly below the 60% greenhouse gas saving, but there is a lot of variation. And for the first generation fuels on the left, there is a huge range of variation, with some of the fuels coming above the global warming potential of petrol, so worse than fossil fuel in those cases. From studying all these different sources of literature, what I found was that there were three different types of variation underlying this. One was real. So these are real crops grown in different parts of the world, different climates and geographies, getting different yields with different amounts of fertiliser applied. And so there's real variation in the greenhouse gas emissions here. There's also a methodological variation. That's how the life cycle assessment, or LCA, is done, where the system boundaries are drawn. And what that means is just what do you include in your calculation and what do you exclude. And there are also variabilities from co-product crediting. What this refers to is where, as part of the production of biofuel, you might get a co-product. So for example, DDGS, dried distillers' grains and solubles, is a co-product from wheat grain ethanol, and it can be used as an animal feed. And so in a life cycle assessment, you might give that a credit because providing that as an animal feed might displace the production of animal feed somewhere else. So these calculations all affect the overall result. The third type of variability in these papers was uncertainty. And as research scientists, this is where we were really interested, because this was where there's a lack of data, a lack of knowledge and information. And the main areas identified were around nitrous oxide emissions from the field as a result of fertiliser use and also from soil from land use change, and the soil carbon stock change that results from planting these crops. And so we began a research programme studying these components of the bioenergy life cycle. So just to echo, this area of the cultivation of the crops is where we focused our research at the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, and particularly trying to understand the effects of land use change and land use and management on soil carbon stocks and greenhouse gas emissions from energy crops which can be grown in the UK, particularly Miscanthus and short rotation coppice willow, but also short rotation forestry. So at CEH, the research portfolio here was aiming to reduce the uncertainty in carbon savings from perennial bioenergy feedstocks in the UK. And this research programme has been led by my colleague Neil McNamara, with contributions from many scientists in our group and with our collaborators. The research is aimed to quantify the impacts of direct land use change to bioenergy on soil carbon and the greenhouse gas emissions of CO2, methane and nitrous oxide. And we've also tested land management and mitigation strategies and worked to develop a knowledge exchange network to increase the impact of the research that we do. The projects that we've worked on have worked around this measurement framework, which I'm going to describe now. So in an ideal world, if you were studying the effects of bioenergy crop cultivation, you would take a piece of land, maybe a piece of arable land, you would monitor the greenhouse gas emissions, measure the soil carbon stock, and then you would plant your crop, and then you would monitor it through the 20-year life cycle of that crop. But that isn't practical within current research budgets and research projects. We don't get funding for 20-year projects. And so what we need to do is use a different approach to try and understand the impacts of growing these crops in a shorter space of time. And so we use what we call a space for time substitution. What this means is that we take adjacent pieces of land, so an arable field and then an adjacent field which used to be arable but is now planted with a perennial bioenergy crop. And we compare the greenhouse gas emissions and the soil carbon stock on these pieces of land, and we account for the age of the crop, the time since transition. And so, in particular in the ELAM project, which is the Ecosystem Land Use and Modelling project, funded by the Energy Technologies Institute, this measurement framework was used across the UK at 4 sites intensively measuring soil carbon and greenhouse gas emissions, and another 70 paired sites across the UK where we looked at soil carbon stock change. And we particularly focused on these transitions from arable, grassland and forestry to short rotation coppice willow, short rotation forestry and Miscanthus. And these are just some of photos of some of the field sites, of the intensive sites that we used in this project. So this is a site in Lincolnshire. These are real commercial farms, they're not test experimental plots. And this is a farm where there is arable land and also willow and Miscanthus planted. And we've installed equipment, eddy-covariance equipment to measure net ecosystem exchange, which is the emission and uptake of carbon dioxide from the system. And also chamber measurements to look at CO2, methane and N2O, and sampling down to 30 centimetres and also down to 1 metre to look at soil carbon stock change. These are the crops we have at Lincolnshire. We also have another site working with Southampton University in West Sussex, where there's grassland and short rotation coppice willow with a very similar setup. At East Grange in Fife, again a similar setup but with different comparisons of grassland and arable to short rotation forestry pine and short rotation coppice willow. And then finally at Aberystwyth, we work with collaborators at Aberystwyth on a study site which was grassland and was actually planted to Miscanthus within the lifetime of the project. And so this is the only site where we have got emissions and carbon stocks prior to the planting of the Miscanthus and through the first few years of its establishment. Now, I'm not going to talk about the data from each of these individual sites a lot because the point of the project overall was really to bring the data together from all these different sites across the UK of all different ages, planted in different places, to contribute to the production of a model which could predict forward through to 2050 the impacts of land use change across the UK if we deployed bioenergy crops more widely. But just to give you an example of the data, this is data collected by John McAlmont at Aberystwyth on the grassland to Miscanthus transition. And you can see that to the left-hand side of the graph, you've got the emissions from the grassland prior to the planting of the Miscanthus. And then the big red arrow shows you when the land use change took place. And then following that, you've got green and blue bars, which indicate the green is the greenhouse gas emissions from the grassland and the blue from the Miscanthus. And what you can see in this case is that the combined emissions of CO2 and nitrous oxide were much greater on the grassland than the Miscanthus. And we saw this similar trend in other sites. And potential explanations for this are that CO2 emissions were lower because of the big uptake of CO2 into this large biomass crop. And also there was no fertiliser applied, so nitrous oxide emissions would be low. For the soil carbon stocks, I want to talk to you about some data which brings together data from lots of different sites. And this is looking at the planting of short rotation coppice willow on the left and poplar, or Miscanthus on the right, and being planted onto arable land, which are the red dots, and planted onto grassland, which are the green dots. And what you should take home from this chart is that actually the data suggests that planting onto arable land, you typically get a soil carbon gain, and planting onto grassland, you typically get a soil carbon loss. Now, as I said, this is data taken from a whole range of sites, and there was lots of variation within the data, but you do begin to see trends in how soil carbon stocks might change with energy crop planting. Now, the graphs, what's shown on the graphs is a diagonal line at the middle, which is the one-to-one line, and you can see that the green are below the line and they're showing a carbon loss, and the red are above the line typically. But there's lots of crossover, and so we know actually from looking in more detail that particularly for grasslands there's a huge variation in the soil carbon stock change with negative and positive effects on soil carbon. And so we've been trying to understand a little bit more, why are these sites so different? So I'll talk about the carbon stock change a little bit more later, where we tried to bring together work from different researchers across around the world. Okay, so I want to talk to you now about the ecosystem land use modelling tool. And this is a model which has been produced by the University of Aberdeen through this ELAM project led from CEH. And the tool is a user-friendly spatial tool which is to explore the consequences of land use change to bioenergy in terms of the soil carbon and greenhouse gas emissions, and predict those impacts through to 2050. And this tool encompasses all the data which was produced from all these different field sites within the ELAM project, and presents it in a very user-friendly, simple format, a point-and-click front interface. And this model is going to be available for download from the CEH website later this year. So if you're interested, you can look at the website later on in the year. Okay, so I'm just now going to show you a little video walkthrough of the model so you can see how you use it, the different options that you can set in the model, and the types of outputs that you can get. And the idea of this really is to help you explore how bioenergy crops might impact soil carbon and greenhouse gas emissions and the greenhouse gas balance overall in different parts of the country, and what kind of parameters might influence the savings achieved. Okay, so as you can see on the screen, there are different parameters which you can set in the model. So you can set the time scale over which you want to run the model up to 40 years hence. You can apply a different range of climate change scenarios, which are low, medium and high. And you can also mask out different parts of land use. And what that means is you can take out, for example, environmentally protected areas such as national parks. You can also play around with the amount of fertiliser applied and the yield. And you can then select the part of the country that you're interested in through a whole series of sets of districts, regions, by country, or you can simply go to the map and drag across the UK for the whole of the UK, or just for a small part if you're interested in just Wales or Cornwall. You can explore these different options. And then on the options tab you can see that these are all the different starting and end land uses. So you can take a land use transition from arable, grassland or forestry to a range of first generation crops and second generation crops. And you can have as your outputs the greenhouse gas emissions, the total balance, the individual gases and soil carbon, and the data can be presented per hectare of land or per oven-dried tonne of biomass. You then set your output folder and for where you want the data to be downloaded to, and you run the model. And then, depending how many clicks you've put in the box, depends whether you need to just go and make a cup of tea or go and cook the evening meal, because it will take a little while to run, but not too long. Once the output is produced, then I'm just going to show you a couple of examples of the kind of output you get and how you can explore through it. So you get a graph looking at the cumulative emissions, and you get a map which shows the variation across the country. And from the drop-downs you can move between the different transitions that you've selected in the model. So from grass to Miscanthus, you can just look at the soil carbon data, you can just look at the carbon dioxide or the nitrous oxide data. Yeah, and then it also does the total greenhouse gas balance, which encompasses all of these 4 parameters. And as I said, you can explore it per hectare of land or per oven-dried tonne of biomass. Now, it's important to stress that these greenhouse gas balance changes which are being illustrated here are simply from the cultivation step, the cultivation of the field, not from the whole life cycle, so they don't account for the fossil fuel displacement. But they are a way of seeing how variable these crops are across the landscape in the UK in areas where they could potentially be planted. It also helps us to see where the emissions costs really lie, and what we see actually is that the soil carbon stock change is the big driver of these emissions, that the greenhouse gas emissions are not so important in the overall greenhouse gas balance, but the losses that you sometimes get when you convert land because of that initial big ploughing and change in land can really influence the greenhouse gas balance, and it can sometimes take quite a few years for those carbon stocks to recover. So that was a little bit of a hurried run through how the model works and the different parameters that you can change in the model. But now I just wanted to take a little bit more time to show you some of the outputs so that you can think about what it shows you. So these are two maps that were produced from the model showing the conversion of arable annual cropland into bioenergy, and particularly short rotation coppice willow and Miscanthus. And this is the overall net greenhouse gas balance, so the cumulative impact of changes in the three greenhouse gases and soil carbon stocks. And as you can see from the scale on the right hand side, this is the net global warming potential, and these figures are negative, which means that this is a greenhouse gas saving. Closer to the blue and the green, you get a greater saving, and so what this shows is that per hectare of land, you get greater greenhouse gas savings from the Miscanthus compared to the willow, but you do get greenhouse gas savings from all of these crops. And this is primarily driven by the increase in soil carbon stocks as a result of planting on arable land. You can also see that there's real variation across the country. So for example, for Miscanthus, you're getting the greatest greenhouse gas emission savings in the southwest and in West Wales. And for willow, you're getting greater impacts in the northwest of England and in Northern Ireland. And so you could explore this to much finer scale through the model. The final figure to show you on this data is this cumulative chart which shows all the different potential transitions and the impacts through to 2050. Now this is modelled data, this is not real, these are predictions going forward into the future, but they do allow you to compare the production of these different crops on different types of land. So what you can see is the top line of graphs are crops planted onto arable land, the middle are planted onto grass, and the bottom line are planted onto forestry. And what you can see is that chopping down forest and planting food crops or dedicated energy crops is not a good idea for greenhouse gas emissions savings. The lines go up into the red, showing that you're getting a loss or an increase in greenhouse gas emissions over time for all of these transitions. That's not surprising actually, but it's very clear that through to 2050 this is the impact. On grasslands it's less clear, so ploughing grasslands and planting first generation crops, you get again fairly high greenhouse gas emissions increases over time. But the second generation crops are much closer to zero, particularly for the short rotation forestry. And actually what we've seen within the data, and particularly in the site-specific data from our research study sites, is that there is a really big variation in grasslands, and we think that that's driven because the management of grasslands is really varied. So you can get permanent grasslands which have been there for decades unploughed, but at the other extreme you can also have rotational grasslands which are regularly ploughed and reseeded. And so the impacts of changing crops on these two different examples of grassland management can be really different. And within this project we didn't have sufficient sites to be able to explore this in detail, but it's certainly something we want to look at in the future. What you can definitely see on the top row is that planting energy crops onto arable land, you get a positive impact on the greenhouse gas balance, and this is because you get increases in soil carbon sequestration, typically on arable land. And this data is all in the paper that's cited at the bottom of the slide. So finally, what we're doing now. So Elam and Carbo Biocrop, the two projects I've talked about, are both completed and the data has been written up in publications, but we're still doing this work. And we now have a project which is ongoing called MAGLU, which is funded by the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council. And we're using this research grant to really dig down into some of the detail of the findings we got from Elam. Elam was a very broad brush look across the UK, but we could see that there were lots of nuances in the data between the different sites which we couldn't explain. And so we're using Maglue to look particularly at important points in the bioenergy life cycle in space and time. So particularly around the impacts of converting the land in the first place. Why are there such varied impacts on grasslands? And what happens at the end of life when these crops are taken out? Is that then reverting any gains that might have been made over time? And so we're really focusing on this in our experiments now with collaborators, again at Southampton, Aberystwyth and Imperial College. And we're also testing management strategies, crop removal methods, looking at different planting techniques, and also applying some of our expertise on UK crops to look at overseas feedstocks, particularly those which are being imported into the UK. So finally, I said I was going to talk about activities that I've been leading as a Knowledge Exchange Fellow for the Natural Environment Research Council. Knowledge Exchange Fellowships are funded to ensure that science which is being done in UK institutions has impact beyond the academic papers that we produce. And so I've been funded over 4 years to increase the awareness of the research that we're doing and to synthesize information on this research to present it to stakeholder audiences. So as part of that, I've been working with colleagues to develop a stakeholder and researcher network which brings together researchers in the UK, researchers from international universities such as Colorado State, Illinois and Antwerp University, and also colleagues at Sao Paulo in Brazil. And we're also working closely with colleagues in industry in a range of multinationals and smaller companies overseas and in the UK, and in policy in different government departments, because bioenergy crosses lots of policy areas. It's an agricultural crop, it's an energy source, it's a transport fuel, and so it covers lots of different policy areas, and that's sometimes what makes it so complex and so difficult to communicate. It's also true of bioenergy that it's truly interdisciplinary, and so we work with colleagues in the different research councils because bioenergy again impinges on the Natural Environment Research Council, but also the Biological and Biotechnology Research Council and the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council. And so this network is aiming to bring together all these different viewpoints to try and understand how best to support a sustainable bioenergy industry. So I'm going to describe a workshop which I convened and the outputs from that workshop. And the aim of the workshop was to synthesize evidence in this research area. So we've been involved in all these research projects for 10 years, focused in the UK, but we know that there are projects going on in other parts of the world with similar aims. And so we wanted to bring these people together to see if there were areas of consensus, because it's been very clear from our discussions with policy people that they feel the messages coming out of research are still conflicted and sometimes confusing, and they want clearer messages. Now, research does often disagree, but we were sure that we could bring these projects together to identify areas of consensus and also identify areas of uncertainty where we could do further work. And so in the table are some of the institutions and collaborators we brought together. We spent 2 days discussing what we know, what we don't know, where the decisions need to be made, what the decisions are that we could influence, and we brought together the evidence over the following year or so. And I'm just going to talk you through a few of the highlight messages in terms of the scientific consensus and the scientific state of understanding around these impacts of land use change for bioenergy. So first of all, nitrous oxide emissions. What we saw from the literature, from a wider literature review, was that nitrous oxide from these perennial crops is typically small, but does strongly depend on the previous land use. And we found this consistently from studies from across the world in temperate regions, and it depended whether the crops were planted onto annual cropland or grassland, the age of the crop, and the type of crop, and whether it was fertilised or not. So unfortunately, so the consensus that we could communicate was that nitrous oxide emissions are highly variable, but they do depend predictably on these prior land use, fertiliser and crop age. And where we identified the uncertainties was that In some cases, you got very high nitrous oxide emissions, particularly during the establishment year, which is highlighted in red on the slides. And this was true particularly for grassland studies of establishment year. Now, as you can see from the chart, the lower part of the chart shows that actually there's very little data on nitrous oxide emissions from grasslands. But where there is, in that year 1, you can get high emissions, and you'll see that the magnitude of the scale for the grassland chart is tenfold higher than the magnitude of the scale for the annual cropland. So the other uncertainty is around these grassland conversions, and we need more data. The challenge for nitrous oxide emissions is that we need higher resolution data. So we know, not just for bioenergy, but for across a whole range of agricultural crops, the techniques that we have to measure nitrous oxide emissions have been very limited. But in the last few years, there's been big strides in the technology, and we're now in a position where we have real-time, state-of-the-art techniques where we can really improve the quality of this data and reduce the uncertainty in this area. So next, for soil carbon stocks. I've told you what our data shows from the ELAM and Carbo Biocrop projects, but when we look across global studies, again from this meta-analysis produced by Kin et al. In the States, we see very similar messages that there's potentially soil carbon gains to be had from planting bioenergy crops onto annual cropland, and there's a risk of losses from grassland. But again, you can see from the size of the bars on the chart that there's huge variability, and so we need to better understand this variability so that we can target planting of crops onto soils that aren't susceptible to soil carbon loss. So using the data from our project, my colleague Rebecca Rowe looked into this some more, and what she found was actually that this distinction between arable and grassland is masking a deeper mechanism, and that is that if you plant bioenergy crops onto a low carbon soil, you're very likely to get an increase in sequestration over time, an increase in the carbon stock. But if you plant onto a soil that has a high carbon stock to start with, you're more likely to get a loss. And actually it doesn't matter whether it's an annual crop or a grassland, it's more important that you know what the starting carbon stock is. So that's really useful if we're thinking about what parts of the country or what soil types we might want to plant on. What we still need to understand more is the permanence of any gain in soil carbon, and there are also issues around measurement methodology, again, which need to be resolved. So I spoke a little bit when I was talking about the model, telling you that the ELAM model and the research that we've been doing has been very much focused on the greenhouse gas savings or greenhouse gas emissions from the cultivation of these crops. We have not been looking at the whole life cycle. And it's really important to put these data into the life cycle context, because although we know there's variation within sites, in particular field locations, it's important to know how much greenhouse gases we're saving if these bioenergy fuels are going to displace fossil fuels. And so this chart, which looks probably a little bit complex, is to try and put these results into the life cycle context. So I'll just talk you through it. So on the left-hand side of the chart is a scenario of Miscanthus grown on arable land with fertiliser converted to ethanol. And on the right is poplar planted on grassland and converted to renewable gasoline. And the different blocks as you move across the chart are the different parts of the life cycle. So the blue parts of the life cycle are the farm operations, the fuel conversion, and this is a sum of emissions over this life cycle. What we've done is incorporate the soil carbon stock data from the Kin et al. Paper and the nitrous oxide emissions data from our own meta-analysis to look at the impacts of these parameters on the overall life cycle savings. And what you get, or what you can see, is that the yellow diamond on the chart is the net global warming intensity. And for Miscanthus on arable land, it's a negative global warming intensity, which means there's a huge net negative emissions from making this fuel. It's way, way below the global warming potential of petrol and below the 60% greenhouse gas saving. So that's a really great thing. But what you can see is these enormous error bars. and this is around the potential differences in soil carbon stock change for these crops. On the right hand side you've got poplar grown on grassland, and you can see it's quite a different picture. And again, it's the soil carbon stock, this green block, which is really influencing the overall life cycle savings. But again, there are huge errors around this data where some scenarios fall below the 60% greenhouse gas savings threshold. So the take-home message from this chart is that the nitrogen emissions, although they're significant, they are not a game changer for the life cycle balance of these crops or these fuels. But the soil carbon stocks are really important and can really affect the global warming intensity which is achieved from the biofuel production. Now, moving away a little from this story around the carbon and greenhouse gas emissions, we also talked with collaborators at this workshop about the wider ecosystem impacts of biofuels and bioenergy. And it's particularly interesting talking to colleagues at Illinois University, Kyle Bernanke and Evan DeLucia, who've been looking, amongst other things, at the impacts on water, particularly the impacts on water availability and water quality of growing switchgrass and Miscanthus. And what they've shown is that these perennial crops, which are really, really enormous crops, they can grow to 3 or 4 metres tall, they use more water than annual crops. And that's not surprising. They use more water at a landscape scale, but they are very efficient. But on the plus side, they've shown real decreases in nitrate leaching because these crops are really efficient in their nitrogen use as well as their water use. And so they're working now to estimate what the benefits are at a landscape scale through regional modelling of hydrology processes and nitrogen flows. Because nitrogen leaching and the indirect nitrous oxide emissions are a real issue for agricultural systems which could be mitigated by these crops. Finally, we talked with colleagues at Colorado State about how we can understand the ecosystem impacts of deploying bioenergy at a greater rate across the countryside. And the only way to really get at this and to understand the trade-offs is through modelling, ecosystem process modelling, which can synthesise these very intensive site-specific measurements which we're doing, which help us to understand the greenhouse gas balance or the environmental impacts in a particular place at a particular time. But really we need a much bigger holistic picture to understand what the impacts are across the landscape. Now, this is really challenging, but it's something that policymakers need in order to make robust decisions about bioenergy. And also we need to understand how we can integrate these spatial ecosystem assessments with life cycle assessments and economic analyses to really start to bring together what are the benefits for the whole ecosystem, the landscape or the community. And this is a challenge which is being addressed currently by researchers. So in conclusion, the research that we've done at CEH and with the collaborators has shown that these perennial dedicated energy crops can deliver significant greenhouse gas savings and additional benefits such as improved water quality. But the impacts do vary with soil type, climate, the prior land use and the land management. And these impact on the greenhouse gas intensity and the greenhouse gas savings which can be achieved from bioenergy crops. The research suggests that maximum greenhouse gas savings can be achieved where crops are grown on low carbon soils, where you can get a positive soil carbon sequestration over time. And also that minimising nutrient application is important for reducing nitrous oxide and nitrate leaching. The uncertainty is highest around the soil carbon stocks, and this should be a focus of research in priority over the nitrous oxide emissions data, but both are important. And finally, from this knowledge exchange working with stakeholders from industry and policy, it's very clear that whole system conclusions are needed for policymakers, and so we can present our evidence on the ecological and environmental impacts, but we also need to consider the economic and social impacts together and try and better understand the trade-offs between these different issues. So to sum up, can we answer the question, bioenergy, yes or no, should we support it? Well, in my view, climate change, the urgency of climate change mitigation, requires an approach where all reduction measures which are feasible, cost-effective and environmentally sustainable should be pursued. And so I don't think it's as simple as a yes or no. We need to be asking what are the safeguards that we need to support bioenergy supply chains which contribute to the sustainable management of natural resources and avoid these unintended consequences. And the evidence base is building and is there to be able to produce these safeguards and put them into place. But we also still need robust assessment of trade-offs to support policy, and so policy can be developed which supports options that mitigate the risks and also provide co-benefits for the environment and for society. Now, if there's more information that you want on this topic, you can find information on my Knowledge Exchange website and also the ELAM website, which are here on the slide. And if you're interested in further reading, I could recommend this report from the Energy Technologies Institute, which includes the findings from our ELAM project, and also this very recent report from the Royal Academy of Engineering on the sustainability of liquid biofuels, which looks at the use of life cycle assessment for biofuels production. Thank you very much for listening to this lecture.